She gave a meal to a homeless man. The next day, 200 soldiers lined up for her. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Rain had been falling on Everwood since 3 o'clock that afternoon. One of those lingering southern rains, cold and relentless. It didn't come down in torrents like northern storms, but rather in fine, steady needles, like the silence between two people who no longer have anything to say. Just enough to soak through an old coat, just enough to make anyone standing at the edge of a decision turn away. Margaret Rowe, Maggie as most people called her, stood behind the counter at Denon's Grill, a rundown diner with a rusted sign and flickering fluorescent lights that buzzed like the dying breath of the town itself. She was drying a porcelain coffee cup, its rim chipped when the glass door trembled and the old wind chime jingled, like a tired sigh from Everwood. Someone walked in. No one looked up. He didn't have the look of a regular. His silver hair was a tangled mess, rain dripping along the trenches of his weathered face. His army green jacket, fraying at the cuffs, bore the faded shadow of a U.S. Army patch, now little more than a whisper of memory in the fabric. Franklin Hayes. No one knew his name yet, but something in the way he stood made Maggie pause. He lingered at the threshold, as though waiting for permission to exist. No urgency, no entitlement, just stillness, hunched, clinging to a small paper bag like it held his whole world inside. "We're about to close." Wayne, the owner, called out from the back kitchen, voice lazy and indifferent. "Reservations only." Franklin said nothing. He stared at the floor. A drop of rain fell from his nose and disappeared into the beige tile. Maggie folded the towel, stepped out from behind the counter. Her hands were still damp. "I can get you something warm," she said softly, like asking a question she didn't expect to be answered. Franklin slowly lifted his head. His eyes, ash gray, carried the weariness of more winters than anyone here could count. His voice was gravel and smoke. "Just some warm water, and if there's any bread, even if it's meant to be thrown out." Maggie's breath caught. Those words, too close to an old memory. Her grandfather Raymond once told her about a bitter night in Normandy, when a French farm woman handed him a cup of warm water and a dry crust of bread she'd hidden under her bed. She didn't save a soldier that night, he had said. She saved a man who was breaking. Maggie turned to the kitchen. A chicken pot pie sat untouched. A customer had sent it back for not tasting right. Beside it, a half slice of buttered toast, still warm. She plated it all, added a spoonful of stewed carrots, poured coffee into the chipped cup, the warmth seeping into her fingers. She placed a clean cloth napkin on the tray, against policy. Wayne noticed. "What are you doing, Maggie?" She didn't answer. She just walked. Franklin sat at the window table, shoulders hunched, hands trembling. When the tray landed before him, he didn't reach for it, just looked, then said softly, "My wife, she used to do that. Always believed those who survive war deserve to be treated like people." No one looked up. No one wanted to feel responsible. Maggie returned to the counter. The wind chime rang again. "You just made me look soft," Wayne snapped, approaching with clenched teeth. "I said no free meals. This is a business, not a shelter." "He's a veteran," Maggie replied, eyes steady. "Even worse," Wayne sneered. "You don't get to make that call. And now you don't work here anymore. You're done. Get out." No one spoke. An older couple bowed their heads over their tea. A student with a laptop pretended her earbuds were on. Everyone heard. No one moved. Maggie untied her apron. Her hands didn't shake. She pulled $5 from her front pocket and laid it on the counter. For the coffee. Then walked out. Outside, the rain kept falling. Wind whipped her hair. Water slid down the back of her neck like ice. She didn't turn back. The tote bag on her shoulders sagged with loose change, a notebook, keys, and the last shred of belief that this place had once been home. For nearly 7 years. A voice called after her, barely audible. "Wait." Franklin stood there, wobbling on a makeshift cane. He held out a worn silver dog tag, the lettering faded with time. "If I don't make it through this winter, keep this. So someone remembers. I was here." Maggie took it, said nothing, just nodded. Then he disappeared into the rain, and she turned away too. That night, in the small room above the auto shop, Milo lay curled under the blanket. Maggie hung up her coat, gently dried the old tag, and placed it in a drawer, next to a photo of her grandfather as a young man, eyes fixed on some distant horizon. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks, and the rain drummed a quiet rhythm on the tin roof. She didn't cry, didn't complain. She just sat there, hand resting on her chest, feeling her heartbeat. It meant she still had time, still had the chance to do what was right. And the next morning, footsteps began to echo on Everwood's main street. Maggie unwrapped the rain-soaked shawl from around her neck and hung it on a rusted nail by the room's door. The second-floor room above the auto shop was the same as always, cold, damp, and eerily quiet. The flickering fluorescent bulb overhead pulsed with a tired rhythm, as if even it had endured too much. Milo, the one-eyed cat, looked up when she came in, then curled back into his blanket nest. Sometimes Maggie wondered, who's comforting whom? She sat on the edge of the bed, wet shoes carelessly resting on the floor. On the old wooden table, her chipped phone showed 18% battery. She turned it on, planning to check job listings. But instead, the screen loaded a video, one she didn't know had been filmed. The title was simple: Waitress Fired for Giving Free Meal to Homeless Veteran. She clicked play. The video was grainy, but the audio was clear. Wayne's voice rang out, harsh and sharp like cold steel. "You don't have the authority. This is a diner, not a charity." Then came the image of herself, small but standing tall, placing money on the counter and walking out in silence. Maggie shut off the phone, but not quickly enough to avoid the comment section flooding in. Does she think she's some kind of saint? Unprofessional behavior. If everyone did that, the diner would go bankrupt. Some defended her. But the voice of judgment always echoes louder than compassion. The next day, Maggie wore her blue button-down and gray slacks, the only decent outfit she had left for interviews. She caught the bus to the east side of town, where 3 diners had posted help wanted signs. The first stop, the Red Spoon, had its hiring notice pinned to the door. The manager, a silver-haired woman named Carol, flipped through Maggie's resume, then looked her over. A long pause. "You're the woman from the video?" Maggie nodded. Carol sighed. "I believe you meant well, but not everyone sees it that way. We're a small place. I can't risk social media attention." Maggie smiled gently. "I understand." At the second place, she didn't even finish filling out the application. The young manager, wearing a sleek smartwatch, glanced at her resume, looked up, and said, "Oh, you're her." That was all. He quietly slid the application back toward her and nodded toward the door. At the third place, Janie's Diner, the owner was an older man with a big belly and thick-rimmed glasses. He didn't look at the screen, just asked, "You the girl who gave that old vet supper?" Maggie nodded. He scratched his chin, thoughtful. "I was in Korea, 53. Starved so bad, we once fought over a crust of bread." He sighed. His expression softened. Then he shook his head gently. "But I gotta keep the diner going. Folks around here, they're hard to please." On the way back, the sky was just as gray as the day before. But it didn't rain. Only wind, seeping through seams in her coat, biting cold against her skin, like a reminder, good people don't always get treated well. She sat at the bus stop, legs aching, staring down the empty street. And there, across the road, was a familiar shape, curled, frail, hunched under a tattered army jacket. Franklin Hayes. He lay on his side, wrapped in a crinkled sheet of plastic. One hand clutched a paper bag to his chest. The other rested over his heart, like holding on to the last warmth left. Maggie reached in her bag and pulled out a small paper sack. Inside was half an egg and pickle sandwich, her lunch she hadn't gotten around to eating. She crossed the street, shoes slapping softly on the wet pavement. She didn't say anything, just placed the bag beside him, gently, as if not to wake him. Franklin's eyes fluttered open slowly. The cloudy pupils glimmered for a moment with life. She leaned down, whispered, "Thank you for reminding me who I am." Then she turned and walked away into the night. Across the street, a black SUV sat silently with no license plate. The windows were tinted, but someone inside had seen everything. He wore an officer's coat. In his hand was a faded photograph, Franklin in his youth, standing in the Iraqi desert, carrying a wounded soldier on his back. The officer lifted his phone. "I found him. Yes, it's Franklin Hayes. And there's a woman, she just did something this country doesn't see enough of anymore." That night, in her tiny rental room, Maggie carefully washed the old silver dog tag. She dried it with a soft cloth and placed it on the table next to her grandfather's photo. Milo meowed softly, jumped onto the bed, and curled beside her, like always. Maggie opened her notebook, not to write another job application, but to write something else. "Today, I lost my job, but I still have my dignity." She paused, thought of Franklin, thought of her grandfather, thought of a generation that once held this country together with calloused hands and unwavering faith in what's right, even when no one was watching. Elsewhere, 40 miles away, Colonel Marcus Hayes, senior officer in the United States Army, opened the sealed personnel file of a soldier who had disappeared after the war. He read the final note. Franklin Hayes refused all honors, chose a life of solitude, saved 6 comrades under fire, wounded, but declined treatment until all others were safe. Marcus looked at his father's medal, sent back from a pawn shop 3 years ago. He didn't know who had it now, but he knew this. Tomorrow, he was going to Everwood, and he wouldn't be going alone. The next morning, at 6:42 a.m., the town of Everwood was still half asleep beneath a thin veil of fog, soft as a winter scarf. The grocery store hadn't opened yet. The bakery had just turned on its lights. The first bus of the day hadn't picked up its second passenger. No one knew that within the next 3 minutes, Main Street would witness something the townspeople would speak of for years, through silent reverence. The first sound wasn't a siren. It was footsteps, steady, unhurried, as if time itself was marching forward, bringing with it figures that didn't belong to a sleepy little town. A black SUV pulled up in front of Denon's Grill. Then a second, a third, then more, lining both sides of the avenue. No sirens, no screeching brakes, no shouted commands, just presence, quiet, certain, impossible to ignore. Then they stepped out, one by one, in perfect formation, as if they had never left the base. Crisp uniforms, gleaming medals, boots polished to mirrors. Marines, Air Force, Army, Navy, lined up from the diner's entrance down the block. Inside Denton's Grill, Wayne was pouring coffee for the only customer left. He looked up when the bell above the door rang, this time not from wind, but from the solid rhythm of military boots on old wooden floors. A tall man, in his 50s, stepped inside, officer's cap in hand, left town with a single suitcase and a reputation no apology could erase. And Maggie, she didn't speak to the press, didn't post online, didn't stand in front of any cameras. But 1 week later, on the east side of town, lights flickered back on in an old warehouse that once stored broken vending machines. Ridgewell Veterans Community Kitchen, a nonprofit run by veterans, named her their official manager. They said, "We need someone who hears people, even when no one else is listening." And on her first afternoon there, while she was handing out cornbread to a single mother and a retired soldier seated together, a little boy, blonde about 7, walked in holding a wax paper-wrapped cookie and a wrinkled dollar bill. He placed it on the counter and said, "I saw you in the video. My grandpa's a soldier. I want to help." Maggie bent down, hand to her heart, and nodded. No words needed, because sometimes one quiet act of kindness can echo louder than an entire battalion marching through the heart of a town. The community center sat at the end of Magnolia Street, inside what used to be an old warehouse, its brick walls weather-stained, its metal roof once torn apart by storms. Now, warm yellow light poured through the front windows, and a wooden sign hanging under the porch read clearly, "Ridgewell Community Kitchen, operated by veterans and volunteers." There, Maggie Rowe was no longer just a woman who got fired for giving a stranger a meal. She was the manager, but in truth, her role went far beyond the title on her name badge. She was the first one to light the stove each morning, the last one to inventory every box of donated food each night, and the one who remembered who ate slowly, who ate little, and who just needed someone to listen. This morning was oddly warm. Milo, the old one-eyed cat, curled up on the window ledge, his tail draped across a tin of tea like a tiny sentry guarding the peace. People called him Sergeant Milo. No one knew who gave him the name, but it stuck the way most honest things don't need explanation. Maggie stood by the big stove, stirring a fragrant pot of vegetable beef soup. It was Wednesday, the day most of the elderly came in. People who lived alone. People who had once worn a uniform. People who were more used to silence than to small talk. Mrs. Laverne, 82, sat near the fireplace, telling stories about her late husband, a mechanic who had served in Korea. Next to her, Luis, an Air Force veteran, was teaching a young med student how to chop onions without crying. In the kitchen corner, Miss Grace, a single mother of 3, was gently stirring banana pudding. This kitchen didn't just serve meals. It served memories. And Maggie was the keeper of its rhythm. By noon, when the crowd had grown, Maggie made her usual rounds with a coffee pot in hand. Each time she refilled a cup, she'd ask, You doing okay? And never in a hurry. A man sat alone in the corner, wearing a tattered denim jacket and eyes that had clearly seen many seasons of war. Maggie knew his name, Dwight, but had never heard him say more than 3 sentences at a time. Yet today, as she poured his coffee, he quietly asked, You still got that medal? She looked at him and nodded softly. Yeah, I keep the story behind it too. Dwight was silent for a long moment. Then he whispered, almost afraid of hearing himself say it. Maybe I was worth holding on to once too. Maggie didn't answer right away. She simply placed her hand on the table, near his. A gentle touch, just enough for someone to know they still existed. That afternoon, Maggie had an appointment. She stopped by the Everwood Veterans Care Center, where Franklin Hayes, the man once called a beggar, now lived in a small room filled with sunlight and peace. Franklin had changed. Thinner, quieter, but his eyes still held that same hardened glint, like battlefields had never truly left his bones, only fallen asleep beneath aging skin. He was folding papers into an old notebook when Maggie arrived. He looked up and gave her that crooked smile, one of those smiles that said everything without a word. You bring it with you? He asked. Maggie nodded and opened her bag, pulling out a small wooden box where she kept the silver star and his worn military dog tag. I don't wear it, she said gently, but every night I look at it to remember. Franklin chuckled quietly, voice gravelly like river stone. I used to think no one remembered. When you forget who you are, that's when war truly kills a soldier. Maggie squeezed his hand lightly. You save lives, and now you're still saving them, just in a different way. You remind people what's still worth believing in. That evening, the kitchen closed at 7:30 p.m. People washed dishes, swept floors, tied up the trash. No one rushed, because here, ending the day meant holding gratitude for everyone who came, who ate, and who said thank you with their eyes instead of words. Before leaving, Maggie checked tomorrow's schedule. Children from the local orphanage were coming for their first dinner. She made a note. Make extra meatballs. Kids always like those. Back in her room, she placed the wooden box on the dresser, next to a framed photo of her grandfather, a man with a stern but gentle gaze, standing beside a flagpole in his worn old uniform. She opened the lid. Inside, the silver star medal, a dog tag with the faded inscription, Hayes F. U.S. Army. A half-written letter from Franklin, one she'd never read in full. Maggie gently touched the medal's face and whispered, I don't need applause, but I need to keep going. As she placed her hand over her heart, just like Franklin used to, just like those 200 soldiers once did for her. No one saw it. No cameras. No headlines. Only the night, and one heart that knew it was living right. In a place others prefer to forget. Forget war. Forget failure. Forget the mistakes of youth. Maggie had planted something that required no politics, no slogans. Silent recognition, steadfast kindness, and the belief that everyone, no matter their past, deserves a meal and a gaze free from judgment. A week after the ceremony, Magnolia Street returned to its usual quiet. But something in the air had shifted, like Everwood had passed through a season not found on any calendar. The community kitchen still opened promptly at 11 a.m. The scent of cornbread mixed with simmering beans drifted all the way to the front steps. People didn't come just to fill their stomachs. They came to feel seen for who they truly were. Maggie Rowe was placing trays of banana pudding on the serving counter. Today wasn't anything special, or so she thought. The children from the elementary school had just left after story hour with veterans, and their laughter still lingered in the air like sunshine. She washed her hands, removed her apron, and turned toward the front door to check for any new visitors. When she opened the glass door, a boy, around 7 years old, was standing there, clutching something to his chest like a treasure. His hair was tousled, his jacket faded, sneakers worn. But he stood tall. His eyes met hers, not scared, not shy, just full of a quiet conviction, as if he knew he was doing something right. He raised one hand, and it was a cookie wrapped in wax paper, tied with a red string. In the other, he held a folded $1 bill in the shape of a triangle. "I saw you in the video," he said softly. "My grandpa's a soldier. He says we're supposed to do something kind." Maggie froze, not from surprise, but from a warmth spreading through her chest. Something had been touched deep inside her, in a place that had long gone cold. She slowly knelt down, placing her right hand over her heart, the same heart that beat in rhythm with every person she had ever served, and nodded. "You just did," she whispered. "Thank you, little soldier." There was no speech, no camera, no need. The boy handed her the cookie and the dollar. Then he turned and walked away, back down the sidewalk like a messenger who had just completed his mission. That night, Maggie sat alone in the small office behind the kitchen. She opened the familiar wooden box. Inside, next to Franklin's old military dog tag and the silver star, was the tiny cookie package. She didn't eat it, didn't unwrap it. She simply placed her hand on it and reminded herself she wasn't alone. Then she began to write, not a headline, not a press release, but a list. Things no one sees. When Dwight said, "Maybe I used to be worth remembering." When Grace wiped her tears after hearing the national anthem during service week. When Laverne paused in her story and squeezed her hand, "You remind me of myself when I was young." When Louise stitched a torn uniform jacket for a younger vet who had no home. And now, when a little boy brought $1 and his grandfather's belief to remind them that kindness is a living legacy. The following week, strangers continued to arrive at the kitchen. A pastor from Ohio showed up and said only, "I could not stop by." A teacher from a neighboring state brought her students for volunteer hours. A group of veterans arrived with 200 boxes of food. They had fundraised after reading Maggie's story. No one organized any of it. It just happened, like water finding the cracks. Franklin now lived steadily in a peaceful veteran's home filled with sunlight and trees. Maggie visited him weekly. They didn't talk much. Sometimes they just sat on a bench, watching sparrows hop between the branches. One afternoon, he looked at her, long and steady, and said, "You didn't save me. You reminded me that I was worth saving." She didn't reply. She just squeezed his weathered hand. Later that month, the kitchen received a handwritten letter in blue ink. No signature. "I was the kid who thought kindness was weakness. But you showed me it's the only strength that leaves people silent from emotion, not fear. Thank you for teaching us how to." Listen again. Maggie pinned the letter to the bulletin board. She didn't tell anyone who wrote it. But each time someone passed by, they paused not to read, but to feel. One late evening, after cleaning up, Maggie stepped out onto the back porch. The air was crisp. Milo followed her, eyes half closed, ears drooping as if deep in thought. Maggie looked toward the fading city lights in the distance. Then down at her hands, hands that had served hundreds of meals, held hundreds of cups, touched hundreds of shoulders braced in silent wait. She thought of her grandfather, Raymond Rowe, who once said, "Honor doesn't need applause. It's what you do when no one's looking." Now, she understood something more. But if even one person sees it, that honor lives on. The next day, a retired journalist came to visit. He sat beside Maggie in the dining hall. He had traveled across states, written about war, injustice, and political upheaval. But this time he asked only, "What do you want me to write about you?" Maggie smiled, shook her head. "Write about the ones no one writes about the forgotten soldier." The old woman who gave up her seat for an orphan child. The boy who brought a cookie. The journalist nodded, writing slowly in his notebook. A quiet server. A town learning to see each other again. And so, time passed. The kitchen kept running. People came. People left. But the soul of the place remained. Above the wooden doorframe, a hand-carved message read, "Kindness doesn't make you stand out, but it makes you unforgettable." Beneath it hung a small hook, holding a slightly tarnished silver medal. People touched it on their way out. No one explained why. They just knew it was how you honored a good deed. Not with words, but with quiet gratitude. And so Maggie Rowe, the once unknown woman, didn't change the whole world. She just held on to what was right in the very moment no one else did. And that was enough. To make a child carry $1 and a cookie. To make a town stop. And to let faith live on as a legacy. In a world that's growing louder and faster, where worth is often measured by applause, share counts, and easily tallied achievements, Maggie Rowe's story reminds us of something else. That kindness doesn't need a stage, and compassion doesn't demand an audience. We're living in an era where indifference can wear the mask of efficiency, professionalism, or following protocol. Small acts, like offering someone a meal, listening to a stranger, or simply looking at them without judgment, are too often dismissed as weakness or excess. Yet it is those very small acts, like the way Maggie reached out to someone the world had forgotten, that can ignite the spark that warms an entire community. Her story makes us ask, have I ever truly looked into the eyes of a homeless person and smiled? How many times have I turned away from what's right, for fear of being judged or misunderstood? In today's world, where everything is prone to sensationalism and distortion by media or public opinion, perhaps the bravest thing we can do is to quietly do what's right, even when no one applauds, and even when it might cost us. The lesson for Maggie isn't a glamorous one. She didn't change the world with speeches or viral campaigns. She placed a warm tray of food in front of a man society had discarded, and that simple act changed how a whole town saw him. In the present day, when so many are grappling with loneliness, disconnection, and emotional wounds in the aftermath of a pandemic, that lesson feels more urgent than ever. We don't need to do great things to create change. We just need to show up with sincerity, the way Maggie showed up for Franklin Hayes. You might not run a community kitchen. You might be an office worker, a retiree, or a student. But no matter who you are, you still have the chance to do what's right. And when you do, even if no one sees it, the world shifts quietly but truly. Because in this world, there are still people waiting to be seen, waiting for a glance like Maggie gave them. And maybe like the boy with the little cookie, what you do today will become someone's living legacy tomorrow. Thank you so much for being here. Your support means everything, and I can't wait to bring you more heartfelt stories soon. Until next time, stay kind, stay inspired, and I'll see you in the next one.